Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Joy Dobbins, a registered dietitian nutritionist. And today's episode is all about soy and soy foods, the health benefits, some common misperceptions, and what the current research shows. And you may or may not know that April is National Soy Foods Month. So I'm really excited to bring in the soy expert. My guest today is Dr. Mark Messina. He has a PhD and a master's in science. He's an internationally recognized soy expert and the executive director of the Soy Nutrition Institute. He's also president of Nutrition Matters Incorporated, which is a consulting company, and an adjunct associate professor in the School of Public Health at Loma Linda University. Dr. Mark Messina, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to discuss with you some of the latest information about soy foods.
Yes, I've been wanting to have you on the show for a while. The show just turned 5 years old this month, and I believe I'm in the neighborhood of, about 150 episodes, and I have yet to do one on soy. So it's been a long time coming. Really excited to have you on the show. And before we talk all things soy, I would love to hear more about your background and what brought you to this interest in soy. I know you have been interested in it for 30 years, so I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that story.
Sure. I often kid that one of my conflicts of interest is that I really like soy foods. And I've been eating them since 1972. And that's because I became a vegetarian that year because my martial arts instructor, I used to do a lot of kung fu karate back in the day, my martial arts instructor from China suggested that if I became a vegetarian, that my martial arts would improve. Now, that was long before I learned anything about nutrition. I had begun my formal education, so I don't think for a second that that's actually true, but at the time I did. So I became a vegetarian, and my sister was one already, so she was cooking a lot of soy foods, and I started eating soy back, 40 years ago or so. But I was working for the National Cancer Institute in 1989, and my job was to identify promising research areas and then make money available for the research community to further explore these new hypotheses. And the head of the National Cancer Institute actually heard a presentation by Stephen Barnes, who's with the University of Alabama, on the role that soy may have in preventing breast cancer. So he wrote the branch I was working in a note asking if we had been doing anything with soy. And the secretary of the branch saw the note and she said, "You eat tofu, so why don't you do something with soy?" And within 6 months, I had organized an international workshop. Eventually, several $1 million were made available for soy research, and that was just for cancer prevention and treatment. But as I started to learn more about soy, I realized that soy may have a role in preventing a number of chronic diseases, and I decided to devote full time to soy. So that's how I got into this field.
I love it. That is proof positive that if you're just interested in something and you follow that passion, look where it can lead. I mean, you have organized 10 international conferences on soy foods and given over 650 presentations in 54 countries. And fun fact, your wife, Virginia Messina, has a master's of public health and is a registered dietitian. So that's also very cool.
Yeah, it's cool because I talk a lot about nutrition. And so I know she's not listening most of the time, but it doesn't stop me from blabbing away. But also she's a really good writer. So she edits a lot of what I crank out. Often people don't realize that. And she does keep me grounded, and we can bounce ideas off of each other. Her specialty is vegetarian nutrition, so it worked very well.
Absolutely. Well, it's worked so well that you have co-authored 3 books with her. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
So when thinking about soy foods, it's interesting. Back in 2000, from 2000 to 2003, I was a supermarket dietitian, and I did a lot of soy promotions with soy campaigns, probably because in 1999 is when the FDA concluded that soy foods are safe for all, except for those who are allergic to soy protein. And we really started using the soy protein and coronary heart disease health claim. So it's all about the health claims, and we would see messaging on food packages, and I would do in-store demos and TV segments, and of course wrote a bunch of information and did store tours all around soy. So to me, it's like, it's all soy good for you, right? But let's dive into what the research shows. And maybe the best place to start is just kind of sharing with us what are the many health benefits of soy, but also what are some of the common misconceptions? I mean, with every food and food group, they all have their own myths and misconceptions. So maybe that's a good place for us to start.
Sure. Well, in regard to the benefits, if you just look at it from a nutrient perspective, it's a legume. Dietary guidelines promote greater consumption of beans and legumes. It's different from other legumes in terms of its macronutrient composition because it's higher in protein and much higher in fat. And the protein is also of higher quality than you find in other legumes. So the quality of soy protein is equivalent to the quality of animal protein. And the fat that it provides is very heart healthy. It's predominantly polyunsaturated fat, very low in saturated fat. And it's actually one of the more important sources of linolenic acid, the essential omega-3 fatty acid. It's striking to consider that soybean oil, which is labeled in the store as vegetable oil, so oftentimes people don't even realize they're consuming it. Soybean oil provides about 7% of a total caloric intake of Americans and over 40% of both of the essential fatty acids, linoleic acid and omega-6 fatty acid, and as I said, linolenic acid and omega-3 fatty acid.
Right.
Some of the products are also high in fiber if you're consuming soy nuts, for example, and soybeans. And then we have fermented soy foods, so those usually function as probiotics. Soybeans are also a good source of minerals like potassium and vitamins like folate. Of course, you have many products that are fortified with calcium, and the calcium from soy products is absorbed as well as the calcium is from cow's milk.
Excellent. And just to clarify, so when we go to the store and we see vegetable oil on the shelf, it's soybean oil. It's just not labeled soybean oil on the front.
That's correct. That decision to market soybean oil or vegetable oil in that way was made in the 40s. I think there's speculation as to why that was decided. And I think the best explanation is that at the time, often the manufacturers would sometimes use a combination of soybean oil and other types of vegetable oils. So rather than having to change the label each time, they would just label it as vegetable oil. But now it's 100% soybean oil.
Okay. Very interesting. So you have laid out this smorgasbord of health benefits or important nutrients within soy foods. To you, being somebody who has researched this and eaten this and studied this for decades, what are the most exciting ones for you? What are the ones that you find most promising or important?
Well, I got into this field because soybeans are a uniquely rich source of a group of naturally occurring compounds called isoflavones. Mm-hmm. And if you believe that isoflavones may have health benefits, then you're going to be drawn to soy foods because if you consume a diet that contains soy, your diet's high in isoflavones. And if you don't consume soy, your diet is essentially devoid of isoflavones. So average isoflavone intake among older Japanese is about 40 milligrams per day. In the United States, per capita intake is about 2 milligrams per day. I always kid that's the amount of isoflavones you get as you walk by a Chinese restaurant. So I was really attracted to isoflavones because of their role, potential role in cancer prevention, and specifically their role in preventing breast cancer. And that was hypothesized in the early 1990s. It was based on the action of isoflavones, some early animal research, and of course the historically low rate of breast cancer in soy food consuming countries like Japan and China. Now, and this is an opinion I've held for more than 2 decades, the good news is that I do think soy reduces risk of developing breast cancer. The somewhat disappointing news, at least for some people, is that I think in order to derive that benefit, you need to consume soy when you're young, that is during childhood or adolescence. I'm not convinced that adult soy consumption will reduce breast cancer risk. So I recommend that all girls consume at least 1 serving of soy per day. The observational studies suggest 1 serving may reduce risk of breast cancer later on in life from 25 to 50%.
And are those results also, obviously, breast cancer is more prevalent in women than men, but men can still get breast cancer. Does the research show anything with regard to consumption, not just of young girls, but of young boys?
That has not been studied. And it's not surprising because, as you alluded to, the percentage of men that get breast cancer is very low. So
it would be hard to study that.
Yeah, to do a retrospective study, you would need thousands of men, and that would be very difficult.
Well, then along those lines of breast cancer prevention, let's touch on the endocrine aspect of soy, because I know that that's one of the common myths or misperceptions that soy, you've talked about breast cancer prevention, but let's talk about risk of breast cancer. And then also if somebody has a history of breast cancer or a family history of breast cancer, before we move on to like other nutrients and topics.
Sure. Be happy to, because that's one of my favorite topics. So beginning in the mid to late 1990s, animal research was published suggesting that these isoflavones, and one in particular called genistein, could stimulate the growth of existing mammary or breast tumors in rodents. Now, these rodents did not have an immune system, and their ovaries were removed in an attempt to mimic postmenopausal women. And at the time, there weren't really many human studies, or perhaps even any human studies, to directly refute these animals' findings. So it caused a lot of concern. And of course, because estrogen, the hormone, stimulates the growth of estrogen receptor positive breast tumors, conceptually it made some sense, even though we have a low rate of breast cancer in Japan. And at the time, it was known that Japanese breast cancer survivors do better than U.S. and North American breast cancer survivors. So there was a lot of concern being raised. And of course, because it's a very harmful disease, the high mortality rate, you can't dismiss the findings from these animal studies. It wasn't until about a decade later, in 2009, that research began to be published that not only showed the animal studies were wrong, but indicated that post-diagnosis soy intake could actually improve the prognosis of breast cancer patients. So the first study was a Shanghai breast cancer study, survival study, 5,000 Chinese women. Women who consumed the most soy were less likely to suffer recurrence and less likely to die from their disease. And those findings were published in the Journal of American Medical Association, got a lot of attention, very statistically significant. And since 2009, the observational studies, the population studies, have shown women who consume greater amounts of soy after diagnosis for breast cancer actually fare better. Now, the clinical studies don't show benefit, but they also don't show harm. So if you take a healthy woman, a woman with breast cancer, a woman at risk of developing breast cancer, and give them even large amounts of soy or isoflavones, and then look at indicators of breast cancer risk, such as the density of the breast, or take a biopsy and look at how fast the cells are replicating, which is an indication of cancer risk, you see that soy is absolutely without any harmful effects. So the clinical studies show safety, the observational studies show benefit, and not surprisingly to me at least, that's why the American Cancer Society, the American Institute for Cancer Research, the World Cancer Research Fund International, the Canadian Cancer Society have all concluded that breast cancer patients can safely consume soy foods.
Yes, and that was in 2012, right?
Yeah, those were in 2012. More recently, the European Food Safety Authority looked at isoflavones and the breast tissue in postmenopausal women, concluded there were no adverse effects. A German safety commission reached the same conclusion in 2018. So the evidence is actually pretty persuasive. If it wasn't for these initial animal studies and all you had were the observational studies and the clinical studies, that is the human research, I think oncologists would actually be recommending soy for their breast cancer patients because, as I said, the clinical data are supportive of safety. The observational data are supportive of benefit.
That was going to be my question is, where did this confusion or question begin? And it sounds like these animal studies.
The lab that published the initial work tweaked the animal model, and they do very good research. The articles were published in excellent journals. They tweaked that model slightly and in a variety of different ways and published about 2 studies a year for the next decade or so. So when you have that much information without any real solid information to refute it, it's not surprising that that became a belief in the American public and among oncologists. And now it's been about a decade since we've seen these human studies published. And I think most of the time now when I read an article, something online from a health professionals, they are certainly aware of the so-called newer information.
Yes, it does seem that research has taken hold. So that's great. Is there anything else you wanted to say on this topic before we move on to maybe like soy allergies?
No, I think we can address the myths whenever you want, because there's quite a few others that I think are refuted by the data quite clearly. And it's just not my own interpretation of the literature. It's the conclusion of a number of health organizations, including the FDA. So I think the bottom line for breast cancer is that I strongly recommend that girls, teenagers, consume 1 serving of soy per day. It's easy to incorporate that much into the diet. And for breast cancer patients, you can have a very happy life without soy foods. So if you're concerned, there's plenty of other legumes that you can consume. But the data clearly show that it's safe for women with breast cancer.
Thank you for kind of giving us that summary and those tangible takeaways. Appreciate that. So then let's continue to talk about some of the other myths or misperceptions. What's the next one that you feel is on the top of your list? Well,
there's 2. The first one is both of interest to me personally and professional because it's this notion that soy feminizes men. I consume a lot of soy, and so I certainly wouldn't want to have any feminizing effects. It's very interesting to look at the literature and see how that started. Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, from a conceptual standpoint, I can understand how some men might fear consuming soy because it does contain these isoflavones. Isoflavones are classified as phytoestrogens or plant estrogens. Estrogen is the female reproductive hormone. So I can see that on that basis alone, one might fear consuming soy, although I think many men don't realize that older men actually make more estrogen than older women do. So it's a hormone we produce as well as women. The other point is, from the conceptual standpoint, is that isoflavones are very different from the hormone estrogen. And you can demonstrate this at the molecular level in terms of how they bind to estrogen receptors. But more importantly, at the clinical level, there's loads and loads of differences between isoflavones and estrogen. Nevertheless, there was a study published in 2008, a case report describing just one individual, 60-year-old man, who developed gynecomastia, which is a small amount of breast tissue, which can be caused by a sort of exposure to an estrogenic stimulus or agonist. And he was consuming soy, and the authors of the case report attributed the gynecomastia to soy consumption. That report probably would not have gotten a lot of attention, except the next year, Men's Health, the magazine, published a huge article on soy asking if this was the most dangerous food in the world for men to consume. They said, does soy undermine everything it means to be a man? So they were unbelievably hyperbolic. I remember calling the editor of the magazine and we sort of duked it out. And I said, you didn't interview one soy expert for this article. I just want to mention in 2015, they did a partial apology for that article in 2009. In 2019, they did a complete apology and acknowledged that they had made a mistake. What was often overlooked was that this case report describing this one individual, in this case, he was consuming 12 cups of soy milk per day, just an absolute sane amount. Probably 3/4 of his diet was from soy. And if you look at the clinical studies, what you see, and this was published in 2010 in a meta-analysis, a statistical analysis of the clinical studies, showed no effects on testosterone levels. I published a review that same year, no effect on estrogen levels. And we actually are in the process of updating both meta-analyses. And we see now with even more studies, there's no effect of soy, even large amounts of soy, more soy than I would recommend one consume, no effects on estrogen, no effects on testosterone, no effects on sperm or semen. And just as a little bit of a side note, an analysis published in 2018 found that in men undergoing resistance exercise training, weightlifting, that soy protein supplementation produces similar gains in muscle mass and strength as does supplementation with whey protein, which is often considered to be the gold standard within the weightlifting community. And soy does not affect sperm or semen. So there's just no evidence that anything even approaching reasonable amounts of soy would have any kind of feminizing effects.
Okay. Well, yes. And there was another example then of N of 1, and then also the amount that he was consuming, but thank you for explaining all the research that has dispelled that. And I'm glad Men's Health magazine came around. Sometimes, that horse is out of the barn, but...
And as you know, a huge article with the man in an edamame bra. Edamame are the green soybeans. So, compared to one line in an article in 2015 and 2019, the damage was already done, unfortunately, but hopefully the science will win out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So what would be the next myth or misconception on your list?
The other big one is thyroid function. And again, this concern was based almost exclusively on studies in test tubes, in vitro studies, and in studies in rodents. And the clinical data are very supportive of safety. That's also the conclusion that was reached by the European Food Safety Authority and, again, the German Commission on Food Safety. If you look at the clinical studies, and there have been at least 20 now, there's no effect on the major thyroid hormone levels, T3 or T4. There was a concern that if you had subclinical hypothyroidism, that soy could worsen thyroid function. So this is a condition in between normal thyroid function and low thyroid function, which would actually require medication. So it's subclinical hypothyroid patients, because a study was published in 2011, which showed that soy did adversely affect thyroid function in those patients. But a follow-up study was published several years later using a higher dose, and there was no adverse effects whatsoever. So I don't think there's a concern even for people who have subclinical hypothyroidism. And the final issue was whether soy might be a problem for people whose iodine intake is marginal. As you know, iodine is an essential mineral needed for the synthesis of thyroid hormones. But again, in 2012, a study was published showing that even if your iodine intake is marginal, soy is not a problem. Now, everybody should consume sufficient iodine, so that's the message there. So there's just really no clinical evidence to suggest that soy is going to be a problem.
Great. And I know that for most people, other than, they enjoy soy foods, they like soy foods, maybe it's not real top of mind, but some people are aware that soy protein can cause allergic reactions. It is one of the big 8, but it's my understanding that soy protein allergy is relatively uncommon. Maybe you could speak to the big 8 and the food labeling aspect with soy being on there and just soy allergies in general.
Yes, I'll be happy to. So if you are allergic to soy, it's a bit of a pain because soy is found in a lot of foods. And that's because soy has a lot of functional benefits. So it's often used by food manufacturers to increase the shelf life of products, to increase moisture retention, to change the texture of a product. So it's found in small amounts in a lot of foods. The amount that's provided or present in foods when used in that way does not make a contribution to nutrient intake because it's so small. But if you're allergic to soy, it's going to be a problem. In 2004, because of legislation that Congress passed, it was mandated that if one of 8 different foods were present in a product, that it need to be indicated very prominently so on the label. And soy is one of those foods. It's the 8 foods that are thought to be responsible for causing 90% of food allergic reactions among Americans. So I think many people are aware of the fact that soy protein can cause allergic reactions. What they probably do not fully recognize is that although there are 8 major allergens, the prevalence of allergy to each of these foods differs quite dramatically. And surveys show that among the 8, the prevalence of soy is far and away the lowest. And if you take an average of surveys that have been published over the past 7 or 8 years or so, you find perhaps 2 to 3 adults out of every 1,000 are going to be allergic to soy. So it does cause allergic reactions like any protein can. Actually, it's been shown that probably about 200 foods can cause allergic reactions. Pretty much any food that has protein in it can cause an allergic reaction. So the prevalence of soy is very low. about 70% of children who are allergic to soy will outgrow their soy allergy by age 10. So if you are dealing with a patient or have a loved one that might be allergic to soy and they're very young, there's a good chance as they age, they will no longer be allergic to soy. So I think there's some really good news on that front. And I don't think that the health professional community recognizes to the extent it should how the prevalence of allergy to each of these 8 foods differs.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and just to clarify, the big 8 are milk and dairy is one, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soy. And yes, I've seen the data on the prevalence. Some of the data is self-reported and some of it is actual diagnosis, which people know a lot of times with food intolerances, quote unquote. We can see a variation there from what somebody is reporting and then, what's actually diagnosed.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's a good point. And self-reported data probably overestimates prevalence by at least twofold, although there are ways to try to control for that. The FDA is currently considering adding sesame seed to the Big 8, and it's part of the Big 9 in Canada. And what's interesting also is that many products that are targeting flexitarians, vegetarians, are often made with pea protein. Mm-hmm. That's a fairly recent development. And there's data showing now that the prevalence of pea protein allergy appears to be on the rise. Mm-hmm. And so who knows, in the coming years, we may see more foods being added to the list. In Europe, for example, it's the Big 14.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm glad you brought that up. Like you said, with the pea protein being more common, and I've heard this about the sesame as well, and I believe it was in another episode I've done on the podcast, looking at using sesame more often. Now we are seeing some reactions to that. But also just to clarify, because you said, it's the protein that is creating the allergic reaction. So soybean oil, aka vegetable oil, will not have protein and people would not be allergic to that, correct?
That's 100% correct. And that's the highly refined soybean oil that you're going to find on the supermarket shelves and that is used by food processors. So studies have shown that because there's so little protein in the oil, that you can actually give soybean oil to individuals who are sensitive to the protein and you won't see any reaction.
Right. So then on a vegetable oil label, you won't see the allergy labeling where it would say contains soy.
That's correct.
Okay. And so that then means, because you said soy is found in so many products, it's got functional purposes, a variety of roles that it plays in different food products. But if the protein level is not there, then it won't be labeled in the allergy food labeling section.
Just to clarify, so if the product contains protein, so soy protein is used for these functional reasons. So soy protein is in Wonder Bread, for example. And I would say that's not the ideal way to incorporate soy into the diet. So it's used in a lot of foods. Now, soybean oil is also used in a lot of foods. And unfortunately, sometimes you hear people avoiding a food or a product because it contains soybean oil because they think they're allergic to soy, or they may be allergic to soy when that food does not need to be avoided.
Okay, great. I also wanted to ask you about absorption and bioavailability of certain minerals like zinc and iron. We know that each food and food group kind of has its own unique set of nutrients that it provides, and some foods are more bioavailable or better absorbed than others. You mentioned, soy is a complete protein and a high biological value protein, which is not common among plant-based proteins. So it's very unique in that sense. But could you speak to the absorption or bioavailability of nutrients in soy?
Absolutely. And so whole grains and beans contain phytate. And this is a storage form of phosphorus in plants. So it's found in high amounts in foods that dietetic and nutrition community recommend that we consume more of. But phytate can inhibit the absorption of minerals such as calcium, iron, and zinc. Now, as an aside, there are many articles discussing the potential benefits of phytate, and it's maybe an antioxidant and may inhibit the development of cancer. It's all speculative, but a lot of these so-called anti-nutrients also have many proposed benefits. But there's no question that phytate can inhibit the absorption of essential minerals. Now, what's interesting is that soybeans contain large amounts of phytate, even higher than other beans, And they also contain oxalate, which is another compound that inhibits the absorption of calcium. But despite the fact that it's high in these two compounds, the absorption of calcium from calcium-fortified milk is equal to the absorption of calcium from cow's milk. It's not really clear why that is, but it's been repeatedly demonstrated. So if you're consuming calcium-fortified soy milk, it's important to know that your body's going to be able to get the same amount of calcium as it would if you were consuming cow's milk. What's also interesting is that a lot of work looking at the inhibitory effects of phytate on mineral absorption have been single meal studies, acute studies. And a study published in 2015 showed that if you're chronically consuming a high phytate diet, that over time, the inhibitory effects of phytate on mineral absorption are greatly reduced. So it may be that we've actually exaggerated the effect of phytate on mineral balance with respect to people consuming high phytate diets, which would be diets that are high in plant foods. Another interesting aspect to this is iron absorption. Again, in plants, you have non-heme iron, which is generally thought to be very poorly absorbed. But we are recognizing that much of the iron in plants, including soybeans and other legumes, is in the form of a ferritin molecule. And there's some pretty intriguing data indicating that when the iron is present as ferritin, the iron is absorbed much better because ferritin appears to be resistant to inhibitors of iron absorption. So we may have actually underestimated iron bioavailability from plant foods and soybeans in particular. Now, if you consume vitamin C along with your iron-containing meal from plants, you're going to get a boost in iron absorption as well. Iron is not as much of a problem nutrient for vegans and vegetarians because plant-based diets tend to be very high in iron. And then finally with zinc absorption from soy is about 25% lower than it is from animal products. Zinc is a little bit of a problem nutrient for plant-based consumers, so it is important to identify good sources of this mineral.
Because it's not as widely available in plant foods, right?
Correct.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. That's very interesting. Well, I also wanted to ask, earlier I mentioned about the 1999 approval of the soy protein and coronary heart disease health claim. And it's my understanding that the FDA is reviewing or reevaluating that. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, you are correct. And I'd be happy to speak to that issue. So the claim, as you said, was approved in 1999. It was based on a lot of clinical data. Over the intervening years, there have been a number of studies that have looked at the cholesterol-lowering effects of soy. And I want to emphasize that it's a direct effect of the protein. Soy foods are high in polyunsaturated fat, low in saturated fat. So when you replace protein sources that are high in saturated fat, you're going to get a reduction just because of the favorable change in the fatty acid content of the diet. But the health claim was based specifically on the protein. So the FDA announced in 2007 that they were going to reevaluate the evidence in support of the existing health claim. 10 years later, and I'm not exaggerating, 10 years later, the FDA came out and they concluded that the evidence was not as consistent as it was when the claim was first approved. They based their decision on 46 studies. To be honest, I disagree with the way in which the FDA interpreted the data, but they have some really good scientists at the FDA, so I'm not questioning their knowledge or integrity at all. I just disagree with the way they looked at the data. So a meta-analysis of the 46 studies was conducted and published, and it continued to show that soy protein statistically significantly lowered LDL cholesterol. It was a modest reduction, 3 to 4%, but as you know, each 1% reduction in LDL cholesterol over time is thought to reduce risk of heart disease by 1 to 2%. So I still consider it to be the reduction in response to soy protein clinically relevant, even at the individual level, but certainly at the population level. And then a follow-up, a meta-analysis was published that showed at no time since 1999 were the data no longer statistically significant. So I think it's a modest effect, but I think the data are in support of the health claim. The FDA had announced earlier that they would make their final decision in May of this year, so we may know fairly soon. One other point that I want to emphasize relative to this reevaluation of the data that I think has been overlooked is that there were 1,300 comments or so submitted to the FDA during the open comment period. And the FDA evaluated each of the comments. Many of the comments raised concerns about the safety of soy foods. The FDA rejected all of the concerns. So this is breast cancer, thyroid function, feminization. So you actually have in the Federal Register the FDA supporting the safety of soy food. So I think that's very important that people recognize the FDA not only looked at cholesterol-lowering effect of soy protein, but as part of the process, they had to review the safety data.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Well, we will stay tuned for more and hopefully very soon. And I always put information in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. So once I hear more about that announcement, I can go back in and add that information and links in the show notes. Well, thank you for that. Is there anything that you can share with us about some exciting projects that you are working on or what's coming down the pike for you in the world of soy?
Yes, there is one that I'm very excited about. And it's not a serious chronic disease, but it's still important to people, and that is the effect of soy on skin health. And we're talking about the appearance of the skin, cosmetic benefits, including reduction in wrinkles. So I've been looking at this data for quite a few years. It's been very intriguing. There are estrogen receptors in the skin, and the type of estrogen receptors that dominate in the skin are the type of estrogen receptors that isoflavones preferentially bind to. And we know that when you ingest isoflavones, they actually get to the skin. So we're talking about oral ingestion of isoflavones, consumption of soy foods. There have been about 8 clinical studies that have shown that soy favorably affects the skin, many of those focused on wrinkles. Now, each of those studies had some design limitations, so they don't allow any kind of definitive conclusion to be made. But the industry, in conjunction with the United Soybean Board, which represents the 600,000 soybean farmers in the United States, have come up with some funding for a skin study, and that should begin very, very soon. So hopefully within about a year or so, we're going to have some really solid data with respect to the potential for soy to reduce wrinkles.
Well, that sounds very interesting. I'm definitely staying tuned for that. Okay, thanks for that little sneak peek into the future there. As we're wrapping up, how can people find out more information about current research? I know that there's the Soy Nutrition Institute.com and there's a newsletter, soyconnection.com. But where can people find out more information about soy in general?
Yeah, I think also the Soyfoods Council. Just Google the Soyfoods Council and you'll get a lot of good consumer information. As you mentioned, the Soy Connection. There's both consumer information as well as information for health professionals. The Soy Connection is a newsletter that has been in existence for more than 25 years. It's a quarterly newsletter, goes out to about 250,000 health professionals 4 times a year. I'm involved with the Soy Nutrition Institute, so the soynutritioninstitute.com has a lot of good information. I write a blog every couple of weeks. And by the way, if you are interested in a topic about which I haven't written, you can make a suggestion on the website and I'll eventually get to writing a blog about it.
Oh, very good. Yes. And as always, I'll have all the links to these resources and information that we've talked about today in the show notes at soundbitesrd.com. And just really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing all this interesting science-based information. Thank you for the work you do, and we will stay tuned for more.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.